Hi everyone, and welcome back to this final workout on general preparation workouts, the important workouts we're dealing with here. We're looking at lactic threshold runs, or probably more commonly known as a tempo run. One of the more staples of a cross-country training or just distance or type training. But there's a lot of sort of, I would say, misconceptions and overthinking about what this workout is. So this is an important workout, but I saved it for the last of the important workouts for the reason that I wanted to have a lot of things kind of out there previously, and also to kind of not put the emphasis on this, because I think that this workout is highly overemphasized in a lot of training schemes. It is very important. We have to do it. It is an important workout to do to get success in this event. But again, this is the reason why this is the last of the important workouts that I'm showing, just to maybe sort of de-emphasize in your mind a little bit where this should fit in. So lactic threshold, tempo runs, we're going to improve lactic threshold, running economy, and mental strength is a big part of this too. Here's a picture of our 2017 cross-country boys team from Morton High School. They made it back-to-back to the state meet. It was the first time we'd made it back-to-back in, it was something like 15 years, and we hadn't made it out of our district meet for 8 straight years prior to this group doing what they did by making it back-to-back in 2017. I am Kyle Giacono. I'm the head of the boys cross-country and track coach at Wharton High School in Tampa, Florida. This will be my 7th season with the cross-country team, and it will be, I just completed my 7th year with the track team at the school. Some of my credentials are there on the screen. Alright, so general preparation workouts. So again, these are the workouts that are critical, important, and not important during the general preparation phase. We've done a ton of videos, one on each of these, as well on what general preparation is. If you haven't watched those, I would highly recommend watching them first, because it's sort of building to this point. These are the critical ones that we did first, the ones that you absolutely must do, vitally important for success in developing the key factors needed for success in the cross-country 5K. We're on our last of the important ones, tempo runs, lactic threshold. These workouts are still very important to cross-country 5K success, but less so than the critical ones. And by not important, special endurance, intensive tempo, extensive tempo, they're not important for the general preparation phase, or your summer training, about the first half of your year in terms of training. So these are important, but not during this time of year, and we'll come back and look at these as we get a little bit later into planning out our macro cycle. Okay, so here's the question that you absolutely must ask yourself, the critical question when you're thinking about tempo runs in your training plan. Why am I doing this workout? Okay, so this is obviously critical for planning any workout, but it's somewhat more so, I think, with tempo runs, just because I think that so many people look at why we're doing a tempo run and sort of the specificity of the event and all these different things, and they're looking for something that this workout won't get them, so they go to it way more often, right? So critically important, anytime you're doing a workout, you need to figure out, what am I trying to get done today? Not, you know, I'm trying to do 400s, or I'm trying to do a mile, or whatever. What am I trying to get out of myself or who I'm training? What specific adaptation? What reason do I have for doing this? And critically ask yourself when you're doing this with a tempo run, because there's a lot of variation and types and why you would do it with different types of people. The answer should not be some version of, I think it's right time to do a tempo run. It should be like, well, I kind of felt like it, or I thought, you know, we hadn't done it for a while, so I decided to throw it in. You can't think of it from this workout type fitting in. It's what am I trying to get, and then figure out what workout is best going to get that result. That's the idea. So this can be a factor in your decision, but it should be after you've already thought about some of these other things first. You know, what adaptation is this type of tempo going to get me? Where is this person who's being trained in their training life and training year and all those different things? And then when you have those questions answered, and you know this is the type of tempo run, then where it fits in and how often you've done it should be done after the fact. Again, this is important. This workout slots in and around the other workouts, the critical workouts that are more vitally important for success in this event. Tempo workouts are important. I sometimes get accused of the kids that I train of saying, Coach, don't you hate these workouts? You always talk negative. And I don't think that I don't hate these workouts. If I hated them, they would never ever do a tempo run, and they are very important. I got to figure out how to get them in and how to smartly get them in. They are important, and we wouldn't do them if they weren't, but many people go wrong by not looking at the desired adaptation, training design, including intensity and the extent, and most often, I think, the frequency. How often are you putting these in your training plan? So, like I said, a lot of times kids will ask me, why do you hate this workout? I don't hate this workout. I hate when anything is done, incorrectly or overdone. And I will say this is the workout earlier in my career, years 1, 2, 3, or whatever, before I started really looking into why I was doing it. I did the same thing. I thought that this was the end-all and be-all. I'm going to throw 2 and 3 of these in a week, and I'm going to go faster is better and all these different things, and not really understanding, or longer is, all these different things. And this is sort of the idea, it's important. Why is it important, and how can we best get it in for how important it is? All right, so we always look at the race metrics. Very important with what we've already just talked about in this video. So, what is the 5K? What makes up the 5K race itself? So, by the study that was released in 2008 by Ingham, they looked at a ton of different things about who was winning races. They looked at body percent, fat. They looked at leg length. They looked at 400-meter pace, running economy, a lot of different things. And what they found was the 5K, 94.3% of the time, the winner had the best VO2 max. Who had the most developed aerobic system, they could use the most oxygen to produce the energy, which is probably not a surprise. So there's something very specific to this metric for the 5K, not only the what it takes to supply it, the length of the race, all these different things that make up the 5K. This is critically important, and I've dealt with videos where we really targeted VO2 max previously. They're in the description down below, and we have to look at how does tempo running affect this in a positive way, or how could it negatively affect this if done incorrectly. That's what we want to make sure that we're fitting within the parameters of. From USATF distance curriculum, we will find that the 5K is run at 97% VO2 max, very, very close to the pace at which you reach VO2 max, 97%, which is probably why there's such that strong correlation between VO2 max and success in the 5K, because those are so close together. And this study that was released by Dr. Matter and Dr. Hartman in 2018, when they looked at the 5K, they found that for a trained athlete at race pace, about 4% of the energy was being supplied by the phosphocreatine alactic system, 10% from the anaerobic glycolytic system, and no surprise, 86% came from the aerobic system. So a lot of this is what's making up the winning percentage of the aerobic system. There is an anaerobic contribution to VO2 max, obviously, but this is where the energy is coming from to make up all these other things that we're dealing with. So that's what makes up the 5K in terms of various metrics of looking at the race. And here's something that I have not spoken to on previous videos, but it's very important for understanding training. It's the law of specificity. Basically what this says is that every training session that you do or you give to somebody else to do, it's going to have a specific effect on the athlete, okay? You do something, that particular training type will do something very specific after doing it, okay? So that adaptation, that specific effect on the athlete, may or may not be desired for the event. So this is why I'm saying you need to understand the event and why you're doing it before you throw somebody into training. Because if you do a workout that you think, okay, well, I'm doing training so it's good, but it hurts their VO2 max, it's probably not going to help you in this particular race. Maybe there's another race where it would be fantastic for, but you need to understand that every specific training session will result in some type of specific effect, okay? May or may not be good, so that's why you have to ask yourself that question of why am I doing it before I get started. So we need to look at this question of how do tempo runs specifically improve performance in the 5K is all we're really looking at in this video, okay? How do tempo runs affect the 5K? That's what this video is about, the cross-country 5K specifically. Not how do they affect the 10K, that's something totally different. The 3K, totally different. The 2 mile, very similar, so we would probably find a lot of similarities here because of this, but there's still differences there. The mile, the half mile, the 400, all these different things, marathon, half marathon, ultra marathon, they have different needs, and different training will get those needs in different areas of the athlete. So that's what we're looking at here. How does a tempo run specifically improve performance in the 5K? How can it, and where could it go wrong potentially? So where do these tempo runs fit in on an energy system continuum? This is from the USATF distance curriculum that I was referencing earlier. Again, we said that the 5K is run at 97% of VO2 max. So I know there's a lot going on in here because this involves all your workouts, your alactic, your anaerobic glycolytic, your aerobic paces, and a lot of different ways of looking at them. You don't have to focus on anything other than this very specific area that I'm going to show you, but this is VO2 max, your VO2 max test, basically your 2 mile, 3K is a little bit faster. You'll see that obviously the 800 and 1500 would be run at faster paces. 10K is going to be slower, marathon is going to be slower. All you really need to think about here is where the tempo runs fit in, and it's this area right here that's indicated with the yellow. So basically, if you think about percent of VO2 max, you're really looking at roughly 85% to 90%. The reason being, and that's lactic threshold running, usually 20 to 40 minutes of running. And the reason that is that is the area where your body is going to be producing and clearing acid or hydrogen ions in unison, and we'll look at that a little bit more specifically. But it's a pretty big window, and it's even actually a little bit bigger than that. That's if you have a trained athlete, right? So we'll get to that in one second. Heart rate, I've mentioned how sometimes you can use heart rate, not just percentage of VO2 max. You could also, if you're looking for lactic threshold running, about 150 to 180 beats per minute, depending on what the intensity is and some other factors. But if you're looking for it, if you find where your heart rate is on your neck as you're running or whatever, and you can kind of still see your watch, if you count 25 to 30 beats in 10 seconds, that's 150 to 180 essentially. So if you're looking for another way of where does this kind of fit in, more intense than our aerobic threshold or easy pace runs that we've talked about in previous videos. It is less intense than those intervals we've talked about here before. So it's kind of that in-between that we're dealing with. Lactic threshold, though, and I mentioned this a second ago, lactic threshold does vary quite a bit based on somebody's training age. Okay, and we'll talk about how that affects the training design a little bit later, but essentially, the workouts, various workout paces are going to be needed for if you have a team. If you have yourself, you can just pick one that you're doing. But if you have a team, you might want to have one group of kids that just joined you, 3 months ago that's still relatively young. They might need a different pace than a kid that you've got that is, been working for 4 or 5 years and has much more developed aerobic system essentially. So that's the idea, is there's a lot of variation here. So that's why you really need to think about and look at all the questions that I've kind of thrown at you, or that very important question of what are you trying to get from this particular workout for this particular athlete. Okay, so that does make this a little bit more complicated, and it's another reason why sometimes this can be done incorrectly essentially. Alright, so lactic threshold running. Lactic threshold, lactate is something that we hear about, so just to kind of clear this up a little bit. Lactic threshold, that is the point in where the body is creating and clearing acid equally. So I'm going to jump back one more time. So the hydrogen ion, basically your body is producing and clearing this in unison. It's the threshold at which your body can clear this out of your system as quickly as it is making it. So that's why it's the threshold at which lactate is being produced and cleared equally. The lactic acid, really the acid's the important thing, not the lactate. Alright, it's wrong to say that acid-producing system turns off, right? So it's the idea of being, oh, this isn't an acid-producing workout. Well, that's not true at all, and I'll show you exactly how untrue that is a little bit later on, but it's wrong to say that acid-producing energy systems or part of your energy system turns off because it's always working, okay? So we are producing acid at lactic threshold running, alright? Lactic threshold pace is considered the point where the body starts contributing a significant portion of the energy from the anaerobic glycolytic system, or that system that does produce a lot more acid. So that's the idea. Lactic threshold is when we are starting to get a significant contribution from this energy system producing lactic acid in a large amount. But the production of the acid at this intensity, but it's not accumulating. So that's the idea. So the acid isn't continuing to build and build and build. In a previous workout video that we did, or I did on VO2 max running, I said the reason why they stop VO2 max intervals or a VO2 max test is the acid. It's not really the aerobic side or the extent or fuel source. It's the accumulation of acid that eventually stops you in those races or workouts. That's not what's going to stop you in this, because it's not going to accumulate. It's going to be building and being cleared in unison. So we are producing acid, it is simply not accumulating because the threshold that we are at is right where your body produces and clears it in unison. Okay? So your body produces lactic acid when it's producing energy with the anaerobic glycolytic system. This only lasts in your body for about a quarter second, though. Your body splits it right here between this white molecule here and this red molecule here. From the left of that over, gets shuttled back to the liver, and it can be turned back into glycogen for later use. This is what causes the problem. This is the acid. This is the H+ ion that we saw on the previous slide. This lowers the body's pH. This is what causes you to stop on VO2 max runs, in the 5K itself. All those different things. If you're trained well, you know, obviously, if you've never run before, the distance is going to slow you down. But I mean, if you're trained, this is what stops you in those types of workouts or training scenarios. So this is what is not accumulating. This is what is being produced and cleared in unison. We usually measure lactate because it's such a big molecule compared to this, because they come in a 1-to-1 ratio. That's the idea. So we're not going to have any of this accumulate, causing a decrease in pH and causing that jelly-legged feeling in your working muscles that causes fatigue. All right, because acid won't accumulate at this pace, fatigue at tempo pace, true tempo pace, is going to be to the central nervous system, to the fuel sources to a point. You have a decent amount of this. It's if you're not eating properly or doing too many of these where fuel source is a problem. You can actually store about 2 hours of stored glycogen. I did a whole video on fuel sources in the description down below. But it can be, it's fatiguing. You're probably not going to fully run out like you would in a marathon hitting a wall, but fuel stores is going to be fatigued. And then there's a lot of mental issues that can do. This is a challenging workout mentally, and that's why I say mental strength is enhanced, okay? Under normal conditions, weather issues can mess things up, obviously, but under normal circumstances, fatigue is the central nervous system, fuel stores, and to the mental side. All right, so I don't want to go too crazy on this, but just to kind of refresh our memory on the ATP to ADP energy replacement. Everybody probably remembers that ATP is the fuel source of the cell. We probably were not taught that when your body uses the ATP, it turns into ADP. The reason being ATP has 3 phosphates, A with 3 phosphates. That's what the T stands for, triple phosphate. Your body splits off the last phosphate, and that sends the energy, the splitting of the phosphate, the energy to the cells. Now we only have 2, then it becomes ADP, or a double or diphosphate here. And then your body, when it's remaking energy, is coming back through here. It's breaking down energy from food to put that phosphate back onto the end, making ATP again. This is all muscle contractions. It's use it, split it off to the cell. Oh no, I don't have energy. Get some energy from the food through different energy mechanics, aerobic, anaerobic, or the 2 anaerobic systems, and boom, we've got ATP again. That is all this is. It's just recycling this over and over and over again, okay? So very briefly, the aerobic system uses glucose or fat, either one, to produce 36 ATP molecules using mitochondria, aerobic enzymes, oxygen, it's aerobic, and the H+ ions that we talked about before. So it's actually using this waste product from lactic threshold running in the cells. It's called the Krebs cycle. It's slow, and the only waste products are going to be water and CO2, so that's why your body can kind of do these workouts forever, because water is easy to deal with, CO2 is easy to deal with. There's no real issue here. The anaerobic glycolytic system, the one that is enhanced at lactic threshold running because of the increased intensity, uses glucose to produce 2 ATP. Well, that's interesting. 2 versus 36. The aerobic system is much more efficient with the fuel source, right? This is why, well, getting ahead of myself, hang on. So 2 ATP, so you're like, well, this isn't good, right? This isn't making a good use of my stored glucose here. And you can use some fat at faster intensity, but faster intensity is used with glucose is the idea. So 2 molecules using enzymes in the cell cytoplasm, so the mitochondria are not involved. And because the mitochondria are not involved in the Krebs cycle, it's very, very quick. It's just in the cell cytoplasm, boom, it makes 2 ATP. So this energy system is much faster, but we have this unfortunate waste product of lactic acid we talked about before, which turns into lactate and the H+ ions. This is the waste product, okay? So this energy system, as we said, we get a significant contribution from it at lactic threshold. So why does this work so well if it's at the threshold? This energy system is producing energy quickly, all right, so we've got that. and it's producing the H plus ions, which is also used by the aerobic system. So these two are working in tandem at threshold. It's making energy, this is making energy, it works perfectly. Go too fast, and this starts supplying too much hydrogen ions. That's where the pH drops, and it causes issues to aerobic fitness and all these different things that causes fatigue. So these two work so very closely in unison at lactic threshold. So that's why we want to make sure we're running at the right intensity, because we don't want the hydrogen ions to accumulate. We don't want this to be the reason we stop, right? The last energy system is the anaerobic glycolytic system. It's always being used. Again, energy parts, they're not turning on and turning off. They're just being accentuated at different parts of your actual workout or movement. So you're using this system just kind of sitting there watching. Uses available ATP in the creatine phosphate system to produce, again, 2 ATP molecules using enzymes in the cell cytoplasm. Little to no waste product. It only lasts about 6 to 7 seconds. We did a whole video on the anaerobic alactic system. These are the two that are being used really in this, but this one is also being used too, but because of the extent of the workout, it's de-emphasized. Okay, so this is what I was talking about, the idea of really understanding that none of these energy systems are turned off really at any point. They're always being used. Again, we need those hydrogen ions to supply the energy, aerobically through the mitochondria. So this is why it's that idea of you are producing acid at lactic threshold. You're producing acid just sitting there. So these are various acid levels for an average trained athlete. So not somebody going out the first time, not the kid that just showed up on your team. Your trained athlete, somebody who's been doing this for a while, okay? So these are the acid levels at various intensities, just kind of sitting there, just hanging out, watching this video. You have about 0.8 to 1.8 millimoles of lactate, okay? All you have to know is that as that number gets bigger, there's more acid in your working muscles, your bloodstream, and all those different things that we've talked about, okay? Lactic threshold running is typically, again, there are some things that are being dealt with here, how trained the person is and that kind of thing, but about 2.5 millimoles of lactate. This varies with different athletes. There are some athletes that their lactic threshold is much, much higher, and there's actually workouts that can push that a little bit more. You've got younger athletes who might be accumulating it because their aerobic system isn't developed enough at a lower acid level, maybe right at 1.8, not that far off from the rest, maybe it's at 2 or whatever, but again, it's about 2.5 millimoles of lactate. This is the intensity of lactic threshold. 10K, 7.5, 5K, 9, 3,200 meters. Obviously, the shorter we're getting and the faster we're getting, the more. And 400 meters, this is why this hurts right afterwards more than anything, just because of so much acid being produced. And it's why that the athletes in the 800 have to deal with the most pain in the race itself, because this is pretty close and you're doing it for so much longer. So when we're looking at this, one reason and one of the metrics that we've talked about here is, why would, say, a college athlete doing the 10K need more tempo runs than the 5K? And it's this very reason right here. The 10K is closer, and this is just, again, one metric, but the acid level that are being produced from the various races is more specific to the 10K when running at lactic threshold. And again, if you're doing this a lot, maybe you can move this even closer than the 5K. The 5K is closer to 3,200 meters. This is one of the best VO2 max tests you can have, and we talked about the connection of the 5K and VO2 max for success. And I'll show you how 10K, it's much more associated with running economy, and that's associated with lactic threshold. So that's something, again, to kind of emphasize, not just the fact that we're always producing acid, but one of the reasons why training for the 10K needs specific training that's different than training for the 10K or the 1500 or the 800 or the 400. Nothing shocking when we start thinking about 400 in this, but it's, some of these other races that you might think naturally are closer together, it might be a slightly different association than you realize. And here's one of the reasons why that is. Not the only reason, but one of the reasons. All right, so I mentioned this. So metrics of the 10K and why I think sometimes people overdo this quite a bit. So here are the two different races. So the same study that Ingham looked at, they looked at who won the 10K. And they found that the 10K was won by who had the best running economy. And they measured that in various different ways. Basically, running economy is who can use the least amount of fuel from getting from one point to the other. We said that 5K VO2 max, 94.3%. Running economy at 89%. But again, that's not nearly as good of an indicator. I mean, that's, that'll get you a B. That's not bad. But it's not nearly as good of a reliable source as the VO2 max is for the 5K, right? So as we are looking at this, and that should be, let me go back a slide, that shouldn't be a surprise because this is still pretty far off. Again, this is only one metric of, you know, why certain workouts are specific to different things, but lactic threshold running is really associated with running economy, and so it's going to be more specific to success in the 10K, but not nearly as specific as the VO2 max is for success in the 5K. So you can kind of see that association, why that would make sense based on one thing, which is millimoles of lactate produced, right? So this is further away, it's less specific, so as we look here, it's not as good of an indicator for who's going to win the 10K as it is for the 5K. I mentioned this already, but 10K is run at 92% VO2 max. Again, that's probably why you don't look at VO2 max for who wins the 10K. We have to look at something else that's a little bit closer, and we said lactic threshold is right about 85%. We already talked about the 5K is very associated with success in that with how good your VO2 max is, and this is at 97%. And this is kind of a weird thing to think about too. So we talked about the 5K. It's much more defined because the race is shorter, less different things can happen. So we talked about where the energy comes from this study from Dr. Matter and Dr. Hartman in 2018. There's more variance in the 10K because of how long the race is, different athletes do it, and that kind of thing. So you got 2 to 3% for the phosphocreatine system. That makes sense. It's less here. But wait a second. It could be more or less glycolytic in the 10K than the 5K. Again, it shows kind of the variation and the very different approaches that you could take to the 10K because the length, the specific nature of this race is very different than the 5K. The 5K is a little bit more, I don't want to say absolute, but you could say it's sort of less open to interpretation in terms of what it takes to win it because there's less variation. There's just less different things that can happen in a race that's this much shorter than this race. And same thing with the aerobic system. You've got some people that are doing it with more aerobic energy, or aerobic monsters. Some of them that maybe are using less aerobic energy than this one because of the swing in the anaerobic glycolytic system. So all of that, just looking at these two races, just brings me back to this point about the law of specificity we talked about earlier, that every training session has a specific effect on the athlete, which may or may not be desired for that event, okay? And we talked about this whole video is looking at the 5K and lactic threshold, and so how a 5K is affected by a lactic threshold workout versus a 10K is totally different. How tempo runs improve performance in the 10K, very different than the 5K or any other event if we were to do this whole exercise with other events. So the reasons for doing them, the frequency and the extent of doing them. All right, so setting all those different things up, we come to this important question, is the design adaptations for a tempo run. This is where you're going to be sort of asking yourself, what of these am I looking for and how am I going to best get them as I'm setting up the tempo run a little bit later on. So let's take a look. So there are going to be cardiovascular or aerobic improvements, right? Increased heart size, left ventricle, specifically more mitochondria, more muscle capillaries or blood vessels, more aerobic enzymes, more blood overall, and improved blood cells. You might be thinking, wait a second, those are the same things that we were doing when we were looking at recovery runs and long runs at aerobic threshold or recovery pace. The videos are in the description down below, and absolutely, because those are. There's nothing different from the cardiovascular system, but that can set up an important problem that people set up when they do these types of workouts, because we want all of those adaptations, but how can we get them in? There's going to be an increased intensity here, so there's nothing different aerobically coming from this in that respect. What we're getting added from tempo runs are muscular and metabolic that we'll look at in 1 second. So this first thing here is the most important reason why we do a tempo run. We get this from this type of intensity and really no other type of intensity. Oxidative, fast twitch muscle fibers increase their aerobic abilities. And that's a lot that I just threw at you, so kind of think of it this way. You've probably heard incorrectly, but it's easy for us to think about it, that there are 3 main muscle fiber types, right? We've got the ones that aerobic kids have a lot of, the slow twitch muscle fibers, sometimes called type 1. They always act aerobically, and aerobic workouts get them more aerobic, right? More mitochondria. The things we talked about, basically cardiovascular in part in terms of the muscle fibers, right? Those are only going to be acting aerobically. They have a ton of mitochondria, aerobic enzymes. They get more with training. They're very efficient. We talked about earlier, they use the Krebs cycle to produce a lot of their energy. There's still some anaerobic activity in these, but they get most of their energy aerobically.
On the other side of the equation, there are always fast twitch muscle fibers, sometimes called type 2X. These are the ones that have very little aerobic qualities. They produce energy very fast anaerobically, first with the alactic system and then with the glycolytic system. They can produce a lot of acid. These are your sprinters, have a lot of this muscle fiber type. 100 meter, 2 meter, 400 meters, those types of things. They're very, very fast, and they get fatigued very quickly because they produce so much acid with these muscle fiber types. These get enhanced with sprint type training. They really, I mean, they can do some work aerobically, but most of their energy is coming from that anaerobic system, and they're really only going to improve in that area, right? And in fact, if you look at these two muscle fiber types, and I'll do a whole video on these, the ones that are aerobic are more red, and the ones that are more anaerobic are more white, which makes sense, the idea of more blood vessels in the slow twitch ones. Then you've got these muscle fibers, these oxidative fast twitch muscle fibers that can be right in the middle, and they can go either way depending on training, right? You give them a lot of sprint training, they're going to develop their ability to produce energy anaerobically. They're going to produce a lot of acid, and they're going to act more like fast twitch. Give them a lot of this specific work, tempo running, and they're going to act more like slow twitch. The reason being is your body is producing energy anaerobically. We said there's that increased contribution from the glycolytic system, and it needs to recruit some of these muscle fibers, more of them, to keep that balance, to keep us at lactic threshold so that the acid doesn't accumulate. So it recruits some of these, it makes some adaptations to make them more aerobic and increase their abilities in that, so more mitochondria, make them act more like slow twitch, which is a good thing in some respects for the 5K. We'll talk about where that can be bad in the next slide, but that's why you do this. This is, for the most part, done at this intensity and best done, and for the most part, you could say only done at this intensity. It's hard to say that in anything biological that it's only, but this, basically, if you want to do this, you need to do tempo runs. This is one of the really big reasons why. You still have slow twitch muscle fibers being enhanced, increased capillaries, increased mitochondria size, number, and surface area, part of this. And this is going to also help us be more economical in running, using less energy. We talked about when you produce energy aerobically, you're using less energy to get from point A to point B. So if we get more of these to act aerobically instead of anaerobically, we are going to have increased running economy. We're going to take less fuel to get from point A to point B. This is really the key reason why running economy is enhanced at this intensity specifically. Now, we talked about in earlier videos that running economy is enhanced with any type of running, and that's true. But the reason why this is increased and important is this training adaptation right here to the muscular system. Metabolic system, increased ability to remove lactic acid from what we said before, more oxidative fast twitch fibers acting aerobically. It moves the lactic threshold because your body's getting better at clearing the acid. We said there's certain ways and there's certain workouts that can do more of this, moving that lactic threshold somewhat. Maybe a normal person is about 85%, maybe you can get somebody closer to 87% so they can run a little bit faster before the acid starts to accumulate, and that kind of thing. That's an important metabolic system change that comes with this type of training. It also comes with VO2 max training though too, so this isn't just specific to tempo runs. It can be done with lactic threshold and other type of running too, but it certainly is not done at aerobic threshold, long run or recovery pace. Increased fat storage and use. This is something that's increased at this intensity that is not done at aerobic threshold. Increased glycogen storage and use. Your body is using more glycogen stored glucose because of the increased demand from the anaerobic glycolytic system, and also your aerobic system is needing to work faster, and this is fast fuel. I did a whole video talking about fuel sources in the description down below. I would take a look at it if you're interested in that. But basically, because you're using more of this, your body's going to be better at storing more of it. It's going to use it better. It's also going to, I didn't put this in here, but it's going to store it closer to the muscles that need it more as you're using it more and more in workouts. So also increased enzyme volume and activity. I mentioned that this is a mental strength type of improvement, and that is absolutely true in the opening slide. Improves mental strength because the extent and the intensity, this is medium intensity. It's fairly fast, but it's also fairly long. So being able to get all the way through it, it's a mental challenge and a mental victory when you get done with it. So being able to tell yourself all the way through, all right, I'm going 4 to 5 miles at a pretty fast intensity, but I'm not going to burn out. I'm going to keep good breathing. I'm going to keep a good mental side. I'm going to go all the way through this, and it's physiologically, I should be able to do this all the way through. that's a mental boost to the kid or yourself also as you're doing it. And if you've ever done a tempo run at this kind of intensity, the true tempo run, you'll know what I'm talking about here, that improved mental strength that comes with this type of training. All right, so I talked about the cardiovascular system. So most of these adaptations are like aerobic threshold running. All the cardiovascular ones are. A lot of the muscular and metabolic ones are. I mean, mental strength, obviously doing a long run of maybe 90 minutes is also mentally improving too. But in terms of the aerobic adaptation specifically, and these other ones that are not only specific to tempo runs, you need to do the at least 20 minutes, and I should say at least 20 continuous minutes. In aerobic threshold running videos that we did on recovery runs and long runs, again, I would really look at those. We really harped on this idea that your body makes a lot of these adaptations after 20 continuous minutes, right? So it's this idea of doing a long run of 90 minutes, takes the first 20 minutes, take those out, and everything else is where you're making a lot of these improvements. Your body releases a protein-like hormone that takes care of a lot of these general aerobic or central VO2 max, we called it in previous videos, those adaptations. You have to get to 20 minutes once you're somewhat in shape after your first week or two, after maybe say a couple of weeks of training. If you're not going 20 continuous minutes, you're not getting any of those adaptations. Your body will not release that protein-like hormone to make that happen, okay? So in previous videos, we talked about maybe you're doing a long run and you need maybe a 30-second break. That's fine. You need a 2-minute break. That's not fine. It's when your heart rate starts to drop. Really, it's more like 60 seconds if it drops below about 120. That's why I tell my groups 30 seconds, just so there's no way we get out of it, okay? Because if you go and you're like, all right, I'm going to do a tempo run, and I'm going to do 40 minutes, but you go for 20 minutes, and then you stop at the water station for, you say you're only going to stop for 30 seconds, but it ends up being 2-3 minutes, and now your heart rate has dropped, and then you go again, you did not get all of these aerobic adaptations that we're talking about. You went 20 minutes, just about to start, and then you stopped. And then you let yourself get out of the zone, and then you started again, and then you went for another 20 minutes, and then you stopped because you were done with the workout. That's where a lot of people get wrong with this. Because the intensity goes up, they start compromising some of these other areas that continuous running can benefit you from, okay? Or they just shorten the run. It's like, all right, I can't go 4, so I'm going to go 3, something like that. Well, now you've also gone a run that should be about, 20 to 25 minutes, and maybe it's 18 minutes or something like that. Well, you've got the opposite problem going on here, okay? Again, this is the area where people mess up on tempo runs. They shorten the distance overall, or they take rests at water stations or whatever. Don't do this. You need the continuous nature, and it's why you can't do a ton of these all the time because, again, if done correctly, these are somewhat taxing workouts. Okay, so how does this fit in for a middle distance runner? You have kids that talk about wanting to do cross country. You have some sprint coaches that are like, I don't want my sprint kids to do cross country, but maybe you have that 800 meter kid that wants to do it, or 400 meter or 300 meter hurdle kid or something like that, and they want to do cross country for the first time. How does this fit in for them? Well, you have to ask yourself a very important question, which was, why is this athlete running cross country? And there's really 2 main reasons why you do it, and 2 different ways that tempo run fits in depending on what your answer is to this, okay? So if their reason for running cross country is to compete at the highest level, a mid-distance kid should follow the same training designs that we're about to go through, these training rules, for intensity and frequency of the workouts. You don't change anything, essentially, for a middle-distance kid, except for maybe the extent. I did not put extent here for a reason. You might shorten it for them a little bit. Still need to get to 20 minutes like we talked about before, but intensity is the same, and you don't do more of them, and that's one of the areas there that messes people up, and I'll tell you why. So many coaches believe mid-distance kids, 400, 800, 300 meter hurdles, something like that, kid trying to do cross-country needs only to run faster. Only faster. Only faster. Only faster. They're going to get worse by running slower. So they default to tempo workouts all the time instead of these slower workouts that are really doing the aerobic work that you're trying to get out of these kids a lot of times, right? Recovery runs, long runs. They just think, they're going to get too slow twitch, so I have to do it. However, tempo runs are the workouts that takes potential fast twitch fibers, we talked about this in the last slide, and makes them act like slow twitch. Not later in the video, we already talked about it. So this muscular system problem of the oxidative fast twitch fibers increasing their aerobic abilities, this is what, quote unquote, takes away their fast twitch. A sprinter wants all of these to act like fast twitch. We talked about this in the last slide, right? The problem is you have this problem of the coaches that say, I don't want to ruin my kids, so I'm going to run them faster. Tempo runs aren't fast. They're medium. They're the exact pace that makes you act like slow twitch, that recruits more aerobic abilities from these types of runs. So that's the exact opposite reason you should do it. You should not be doing more of them. Same amount. If the kid is doing cross country to compete at the highest level, okay? So that's the main focus here. Also, you have the problem that a lot of times these kids that are moving up, they don't know how to go slowly enough. They don't know what a recovery run feels like or whatever. So that's the other problem. They get their coach saying run faster, and they've their whole life been told faster is better, faster is better. This is one of the times where you have to kind of educate them to realize if you run right at this intensity, you're going to hurt yourself in your next track season, okay? But you're going to want to do this with a kid who you want them to compete at the highest level in cross country. You want the best cross country runner they can be in this season, and you're like, we'll take care of track when we get there, okay? So that's the one scenario. The other scenario is going to take this completely out of the picture where you would never do a tempo run with this kid. If cross country is just a tool to expand someone's aerobic system for track, then there are much better workouts that will create this training adaptation, which is help their aerobic system, okay? Much better workouts that will create this adaptation without hurting what makes a true mid-distance runner great. It won't convert any of these, right? Recovery runs and long runs, modified distance for these kids, obviously. VO2 max runs, hill runs. There's a lot of other things that get what we want here, and then other things like hill runs to strengthen them or whatever that they normally don't get in a sometimes sprint training protocol. These are the things you should be doing, and just forego the tempo run. Again, if this is simply a tool, you have a kid that's like, all right, I want to run cross country. You know, you're the head track coach, and I want to work with you during this time. I want to still be doing something, and I'm not doing maybe another sport or whatever. But I don't want to run a full season. I don't want to run every single meet. I want to do a couple of them as, you know, maybe 2 or 3 or whatever as just workouts. I want to do some of the workouts. I want to do some of these other things, you know, faster twitch type things for those kids. That's perfectly fine. And those kids you wouldn't really think about having on your team that's trying to get to states or whatever anyway. In which case, don't do tempo workouts. It just doesn't fit the specificity of what you're trying to get out of this kid. Just like we talked about earlier, knowing why you're doing it. Once you come up to these 2 scenarios, you just find that this doesn't make sense because of this particular training adaptation, okay? If this is the case, these kids will not live up to their full potential in cross country like they would have in the first scenario. But they will be better prepared for the track season. So, essentially pick your poison. What are you trying to get from this kid? And don't go halfway on it. Don't be that coach that's like telling the kid, oh, yeah, we're just going to improve it, but really you want them to be up here. You know, be honest with yourself, be honest with the kid and everything, and figure out what you want to do, because you can mess yourself up by bouncing in between these 2 different scenarios, okay? So, now let's really get down to figuring out what those intensities are that we were just mentioning, okay? And we always use our VO2 max data to do this. I have a video in the description down below that shows you how to do a bunch of different VO2 max testing. We're going to look first at the Astron protocol, which is 2 miles, best pace. Let's say that fictitiously we have a kid that goes 10:30. Pretty good if a kid's doing that in, say, the middle of June or July. Not too shabby. 3 different main paces you're going to be doing your tempo workouts at, okay? So first we need to find the mile pace from the 2-mile test, okay? Which tells us a VO2 max, or the velocity at which their body reaches VO2 max, is 5:15 on this date for this kid, which you're going to obviously retest them, as I mentioned in the previous videos, and it'll change as the season goes on. So, standard tempo workout, okay? Or better known as right at the lactic threshold, which we said is 85%. I think this is what a lot of people think they're doing when they're doing tempo runs, when really they're doing something else. You'll find this is actually probably higher intensity than you expect a tempo run to be. So a 10:30 kid, actually I'm going to say 84 to 86%, just so it's a little bit more narrow. But you can, I mean, a little bit more broad, but you might want to make it right narrow for yourself or whoever you're training. Figure out how many seconds are in 5:15, which is 315. You know, 5 times 60 plus 15, divide by 0.85 to get a bigger number, because this is a slower pace. We get 375 seconds, which is 6:15. Same thing with 86%, 0.86, we get 366. We got 6:06. That's pretty fast, relatively, for the extent that we're going, and this is the best way to run right at lactic threshold for a kid, let's say it's been training for more than a year with you. We'll talk about some other reasons why you might have different paces for people, but most kids that are running 10:30 have probably been running for at least a year, let's say, okay? Moderate tempo, the other type of pace. This is subjective, and it's because this is the workout, and I'll really explain this a little bit later on. This is the workout that is for your newbies, okay? Your kids that we said, their lactic threshold isn't right at 85% because they haven't built up the aerobic system yet enough to clear the acid, to use the acid. So they're going to be at a point where the acid is stationary or not accumulating at a lower intensity, okay? It's subjective. I myself have found that it's probably, depending on the kid, now if it's their first day out, it's going to be probably whatever they can hold for a 20-minute run. But I'd say about 78 to 82% is a decent window, but I'm just going to say subjective here because that's just simply from my doing this for the last few years, okay? So you do the same thing. 315 divided by 0.78, you get 403, which is 643. 315 divided by 0.82, 384 seconds, we got 624, okay? I think that most of the times, if you'd have a kid that is 10:30, typically when they would say, I'm going to do a tempo, or they say, I'm going to go 6:30 for however many miles. That's right in this workout that is for your newbies. It really is not going to benefit a kid that's been running for a decent amount of time. And this is another area where people, I think, get tempo runs wrong. It's because they don't run them fast enough. They think that that's fine, and it's not. It's not right at lactic threshold, and it's not going to be getting a lot of the adaptations that we talked about previously. The ones that are specific to tempo runs running right at your lactic threshold, okay? You're still going to get running improvements, but this kid, if they've been running for more than a year, all they're doing here is they're doing a way too fast recovery run, and they're potentially hurting themselves for later days. Someone who's new, this would be good for them. All right, a fast tempo run. Another very specific reason why you would do this we'll talk about later on. It's right at critical velocity or close to 10K pace. I'd say about 88 to 92%. 92% is generally associated with critical velocity. It's where you run your 10K at, okay? So this is going to be faster, and I'll explain in the next slide why you would do this, but you do the same thing. So divided by 0.88, 357, you get 557, okay? That's pretty quick. 315 divided by 0.92, 342. We've got 542. So that's obviously a faster window. This is a more intense workout, and I'll explain why you would do that in the next slide, as I mentioned. All right. So you might be doing the VHO protocol test, and I talked about, again, the whole video, why you would do different testing types. This might be better for that middle distance kid we discussed in a previous slide that's trying to do cross country the first couple tests. They're going to do a mile. Best pace, let's say fictitiously, they go 4:55. What you have to do is you have to convert that because you're going to run a mile faster than a 2 mile, obviously. We find that it's at 91%. So if we have this pace here of 4:55, we get how many number of seconds? So 4 times 60 plus 55. We're dealing with 295 seconds in 4:55. Divide that by 0.91 to get the 91% of it. 324 seconds. So they have a VVO2 max of 524 at that point, just like this kid was 515. It makes sense. It takes more aerobic strength or aerobic development to go 10:30 than it goes to go 4:55. Then you just set up your intensities just like before. You just replace the 315s with 324s, and you go through and you get the different workouts based on that person, and you'll find the range is basically the same here. We've got, what, about 9 seconds, we got 10 seconds, a little bit of a tighter window in here, or 20 seconds, excuse me, 20 seconds about in here. That's how you set up your workout intensity, all right? So let's see why would we do these different types, the training designs for the different tempo runs, okay? 1 per microcycle, or every other microcycle in general prep. Remember, these are important. They're not critical. Get them in as much as you can, but where it makes sense. You can also do these the day after a faster run, but this is usually later in the year, and I'll show you how that kind of fits when we look at our fictitious calendar in a little bit. All right, your standard tempo run, your lactic threshold run, right at 85%, or as I said, I give my group 84 to 86%. This is most common tempo run, and it's good for most runners. You've got a kid that's been running with you for a year, they're going to be doing this a decent amount. You got a kid that's been with you for 2 years, probably 3 years, most likely 2, and I'll show you where that might split off a little bit as you get really, really advanced kids. This is for most of your runners. You're going to say you're going to run right at 85%. You give them that window, however you want to kind of make it. Again, I suggest 84 to 86%. And you say, we're going to run, jump over this point here, 3 to 5 miles, 20 to 40 minutes, depending on what you're trying to get done that day, how in shape they are, okay? Typically what I do is I set distance for like my top group, my top boys, and I'm like, all right, so if I'm running 4 miles, I know that's probably going to be about 20 to 25 minutes, something like that. If it's 5, it's probably going to be 25 to 30. I don't typically go more than 30 minutes. I just don't think there's a lot of return, but you certainly can if it's something that you're trying to get out of your group or yourself. That's how I do it. And then everybody after that, I just give them that time window, and it ends up being the same time at lactic threshold. So that's how you kind of do it if you have a bunch of different groups. Check for proper pacing on mile 1. The tendency is to go way too fast on mile 1. You've done your VO2 max workouts and everything. And they're going to be kind of gassed up for this day because they know it's somewhat high intensity. It's really easy to go too fast on mile 1, so make sure you're in the proper pace for where you are at that part of the training year. These miles can be straight through or broken up. Traditionally, these are straight through. Here in Tampa, Florida, we're going to have days pretty soon here where we don't get below 80 degrees, and we have a dew point of 1,000,000%, and it's just not physically possible to do them all the way straight through without it lagging at the end. So I hybridize this for me in our situation where sometimes, let's say we're doing 4 miles. I might have them do 2 miles, which for us is perfect to get to one of our water stations, and I have them for 30 seconds. They jog, almost as like a recovery jog that you might do on intervals, but only for like 30 seconds, just enough to mentally reset. Maybe a little bit of the heat gets off of them, but they're at a water station, they can get water. That's really the important reason why I kind of brought that up. If it's going to be broken up 30 seconds and go right through like we talked about before, you go longer than that at the water station, you start compromising by going longer. Now you've totally changed the game and you're really hurting yourself on these days. We talked about earlier on having a bunch of different paces, and here's the reason why. So maybe you have your core group doing standard tempo, but you've got some newbies here and you want to give them a tempo type training, but they're not able to go 85%. And we talked about roughly 78 to 82%. You might need to hybridize this for whatever group you're working with. Great way to start working on lactic threshold for these brand new runners you may have, whose lactic threshold is much closer to aerobic threshold. I would say if they're less than a year of training age, you might want to have this number or this workout at your disposal to do if you need be, okay? You don't want them trying to do this and then halfway through they always kind of break down. They also are just adapting to everything else you're doing. Kids that have been running for, say, a year, there's no real physical benefit added for these experienced runners. And I said a lot of times people accidentally are doing this and they think they're tempo running, and they're really not working lactic threshold at all. They're not doing all those things we talked about. They're just doing aerobic type stuff, but there's much better ways of doing general aerobic or central VO2 max development if you're a kid that's more than a year. So when I keep track of the paces for my kids, the kids that have been with me for longer, I don't even bother calculating this after the VO2 max test. Those newbies, I definitely do. You're probably not going 5 miles with these kids, but the idea being is it's the intensities that's training. You're going to hybridize this to where it makes sense for this group if they're somewhat newer. You might have a kid that's super strong. Maybe that kid that ran 10:30 is only in their first 3 months of running. I mean, that's a amazing find. So they may have to do this, but that would be the only situation you're probably going to get all the way out because their pace is going to be that much slower than some of these other groups. Same thing, miles are straight through or can be broken up, but if you do break them up, very, very short break if you're going to do that, so that doesn't change, okay? It's the intensity that change and who's doing it. Where are they in their training life? And the last one, we've got these fast tempos that I said are close to critical velocity, about 88 to 92%. Used only for very experienced runners. And what do I mean by that? Ones who have fully developed VO2 max systems, okay? They've been with you for probably 3 years. Maybe they've been running in middle school. Those kids that come out and they were doing middle school cross country or track or whatever. Very developed. Their systems have been trained for a while, and it's used to improve fitness in other ways as this metric, VO2 max, may have plateaued. And you're trying to push things by moving the lactic threshold. My group of about 25 kids, I have one kid in this situation, and that one kid is going to be selectively getting this workout throughout the training year, okay? And it might be days where I start with maybe a couple miles here and finish with a couple miles here or something like that. This is your rare. You're not going to have every kid get to this point. You have to really think, is this kid, and this is the kid that I'm talking about is somebody who's, when we do VO2 max miles, aerobic power miles, if they run at 5 flat, they're too slow. Their VO2 max is that developed. They're usually in, they're in the 450s or 450 or something like that. There's only going to be so much more benefit from tagging that system. We have to move it in other ways, and that's why you would do this fast tempo run. They have to be very, very experienced runners in terms of how long have they been working this type of training. 3 to 5 miles, 20 to 40 minutes. Or as I said, you can actually kind of vary it up if you want to by, like I said, I'm going to start off probably by doing a couple miles and then move to a couple miles of this in the workout itself. just like before, miles straight up are broken through, but the brakes are the same. You see, a lot of the things here are the same. The only things that are changing are the intensity based on what that person specifically needs from this training scheme. Here's an idea, though. Is there a reason why I would do fast tempo or critical velocity with all of your runners, regardless of where they are? And there absolutely is. But that would be done as intervals later in the year. I'll do that tempo 400 kind of thing right at 88 to 92% later on in the year as I'm transitioning away from continuous tempo runs. We're getting to the end of the season. And there's a perfectly good reason why you do that with all of those kids. But that's just intervals. That is done later in the year. That's a great, great thought, and we will get to that in later videos. And another classic tempo type workout is a fartlek run. This is periods of aerobic threshold or easy pace running mixed with bouts of work at the desired tempo pace wherever you are, moderate, standard, or fast tempo. That kid I was mentioning, I might have him do this the first time through, but there are some danger points with fartleks too. And you might start fartleks with these kids that you think maybe can't go all the way through it. So it does mix things up, and it doesn't take as long to recover. So maybe you really are just trying to start brand new kids and you want to do it. That's one way of doing that also. Maybe you want to do this on a Thursday and you've got an important meet Friday morning and you want to get some tempo work in, but you don't want to really tag them. Say you do 10 times minute pickups in this aerobic threshold fartlek. It's only 10 minutes versus 20 minutes. You're getting some aerobic benefits. You're getting some tempo benefits. That's a way you can do it. The problem that you sometimes have with this are twofold. Make sure it's still 20 plus minutes that we've talked about. Don't lose your volume. But it's tough to be careful on proper pacing, right? You've got kids that have been doing it for a while. They might know what tempo pace feels like. They're using GPS watches. They take a little bit of time to cycle, and it's a lot of things can go wrong. I'll just tell you, I don't really do fartlek workouts anymore. I did early on, but it's just not. It's not a lot of things can go wrong. There's a lot of variables here. Now, there's a lot of variables in running, so maybe it's something that you want to do. I just know that for me, when I weigh the benefits and costs for this, I've kind of gone away from this in about the last 4 years. I'd rather kind of go straight through. It's that idea of knowing what you want to train that day and train it. This can, sometimes they start racing each other. You want them to do this, and they start doing this, or faster paces. Or maybe they go really fast. Maybe they're accidentally going VO2 max or faster early on, and then they end up dying off and they can't do it. Lots of things can go wrong, so be very careful about proper pacing if you think this is the right workout to get what you want in terms of your tempo workout in. All right, so before we look at our fictitious training here, how to fit these in, these are medium intensity, higher volume days. If done right, there's no real waste product, right, because we're not accumulating acid, but we are going to use a ton of fuel, okay? There's just so much fuel that's being used on this because we talked about the idea that your body's having to supply the energy quicker. Glycogen is fast fuel. You only store about 2 hours worth of glycogen. That's where the issue can come in from. Fatigue of the central nervous system, which takes about 12 to 24 hours to recover. That's just like a long run and recovery run. Fuel stores is the reason why this takes longer because it can go to 48 hours depending on how long and what type of tempo you're doing and what you've done in and around it. And then the mental side, as I said, this is an important training adaptation. That's obviously a question mark based on your kid, how long it takes to recover from a workout like this, which is mentally challenging. Typically, they require about 48 hours to recover from. So sequencing is a bit trickier, and I said you can also sort of backdoor these with harder workouts, and I'll show you how that will fit in here as we look at our fictitious general preparation calendar. Okay, so again, this is a fictitious training plan. In Tampa, Florida, we're not allowed to work with our kids because of the coronavirus lockdown. But this is based on a perfect world. If, our state meet is hopefully going to happen on November 7th. So this is backdated from that. This is just general prep, so June, July, and August. In a perfect world, if we could start working with our kids on June 1st, which would normally be sort of the start of the next athletic year for us in Florida, this is how it could work. This would give you 23 weeks to the state meet. If your state meet is not on November 7th, or you have a different, maybe you want to prep for a different, maybe regionals or whatever you're getting to state meets, or maybe some other type of time, you have to kind of adjust that. This is based on 23 weeks to get ready for a state meet on November 7th. So you might want to adjust this for you. So these are all the different workouts we've talked about in these previous videos. So I've left those on here. We've got our recovery runs, our staple. We've got our short hill intervals. We've got our long runs and our alactic runs, our VO2 max tests, as well as our VO2 max intervals. And now we've got the tempo run highlighted here in yellow. These are how these sort of mix in, right? So we've got no tempo run here. We don't have a VO2 max test yet to really accurately set data, so I don't want to screw around with that. I might make this sort of a fartlek type run. I talked about having pickups in recovery runs. That could be the case. Certainly wouldn't do that here because we said there's another tempo workout in here, but we've got one in week 2, week 3, week 4. Okay. Week 5, we do not have one. And then in week 6, 7, 8, 9, we've got one. And then in August, week 10, we've got one, and week 11, we've got one. So by my count, that is 9 tempo workouts in 11 weeks. So it is important to get in there, and you can definitely get a lot of them, especially in general prep. Okay, there's only so many workouts you can do, so it's still, like I said, it's trickier because of the 48 hours, but it's not like it's not all that challenging to get in general prep because you only have so many workouts that you're dealing with, right? The only other workout that you're worried about in terms of glycogen use and that kind of thing is the VO2 max run, so you're really only making sure those are separated by a little bit of time so that you can properly recover and all of that. So that's not too challenging to get in as you're doing this. So I did mention that you can backdoor this from something that's a little bit harder, higher intensity. So I didn't do that, though, again, for the same reason that I don't need to. We've got tempo run, recovery run. We've got a recovery run before, recovery run. We've got a recovery run, a long run, a recovery run here in August. We've got a lactic. That doesn't burn glycogen at all. We've got a long run. So I didn't do it here, but you definitely could, okay? The question is, why would you in general prep when the only other glycogen destroying type workout is VO2 max? That's the idea here. So you certainly could have taken this tempo run and put it right here after the VO2 max test, or this tempo run and done it right after the VO2 max workout. I do that later on in the year. There's really no reason to do it here because what do you have later on in the week that's potentially going to burn a bunch of glycogen? So that's the idea here. If you were, say, here's the first week of specific prep. I'll really explain this in a later video. Here's our first meet. This is a highly unimportant meet. So I talked about how you can kind of get this in weeks when you have unimportant meets. You might have something like, say, a medium hill. This is a no-hill week, but that would be something you'd want to be a little bit careful of what's in and around it. So maybe you'd have a long run right here and then a VO2 max workout, intervals, or a test. You could do a tempo run right here on Thursday. They're not going to be fully recovered, but as I said, I don't really care about this meet anyway. It's one of those mandatory meets that we have to do on our schedule, so I don't really mind doing that that close. If this was an important meet, you would probably not want to do it here on Thursday, a tempo run, because you're going to be lacking a little bit of recovery for this. You could also do the tempo run on Tuesday, but then if you're trying to get another what is sometimes called a quality workout, like your VO2 max workout here, well, now you've made it too close. The tempo run is kind of like right there. Like, can I do it 2 days before a meet? You can. You can still get pretty good performance. There's going to be a little bit of a linger, not a ton. But some of those other workouts that require 48 hours, your VO2 max and that kind of thing, you probably don't want to do that on Thursday unless you just absolutely do not care at all about this meet. But a tempo run is kind of that sweet spot of 48 hours. Maybe it's more like a 40-hour recovery or something like that. It's just very, very close in how you can do it. So that's how you can do it.
All right, so to wrap up our discussion on this, let's see what these pair great with and what they do not pair very well with tempo type runs. They're great to do an added cool down. So we talked about not letting the volume slip, going 2 to 3 miles at an easy pace afterwards. So heart rate of 120 to 150, not their recovery pace from previous videos, but just based on that heart rate immediately after. And the immediate, I probably should have bolded and put a bunch of like sparklers or something around it to make that important. After will add their overall aerobic development. We typically get 7 to 8 miles on these days. So let's say you go out and you're like, all right, I'm doing a 4-mile tempo run. You do it and it ends up being, I don't know, 25 minutes, something like that. And then you immediately stop, you go and get water, you hang out, and then some other people finish, and then you go out with them, and it's been 3, 4, 5 minutes or something. Well, you've restarted that clock on that 20-minute window we talked about, okay? So what I tell my group to do is, you know, you've got a group of about 3 or 4 that are up front, and then another group of about 5 to 6, or whatever, that are somewhat similar paces. They're going to separate because their paces are a little bit different. Some of them might be all together in this, but a lot of them are going to separate. You got them. They finish with their time or their distance, depending on how you want to do it. And then stop, look around where your teammates are, and jog to them. Start your recovery right then, your easy cool down afterwards, right then to get it started so you never have that lag, that part where the window stops. So now you've got a tempo run of, say, 4 miles and a recovery run, or a cool down afterwards of about 3. You've got 7 continuous miles, probably something like 40 to 45 minutes continuous running, you get the best of both worlds. You don't lose the volume on this day, and it's a great way of making it all come together on that. Okay, so the jog togethers, they start their watches or whatever, or they know what their route is to do their cool down. They meet up with each other and they kind of go out, and they're doing their cool down in sort of somewhat smaller groups still. Do not let the volume slip on these days. This is one of the areas where people go wrong with tempo runs. So this is how you can add to it. You don't want to, whatever you do for your warm-up, mile, 2 mile, we do about 1.5 miles with everything, and then only do, say, 4 miles. So you've only got a 5-mile day. For a kid that's relatively in shape, a good high school boy, 5 miles would be an incredibly low volume day, especially in general prep where you're trying to get the volume up. So don't let it slip on these days. This is great for some relaxation techniques. I talked about this in a previous video on VO2 max intervals. You do your cool down, we just talked about. You do your stretching, whatever you feel is appropriate. And then 5 to 10 minutes, find a place where you can have them prop their legs up or you prop your own legs up. A fence. I like a bench because you can do it where you're just sitting there and there is no muscle tension at all. And your legs are above your heart. You're redistributing the blood throughout your body. Tell them or yourself, keep your eyes closed. Just sort of relax. 5 to 10 minutes. Their heart rate's going to come down. Keep talking to an absolute minimum. It helps speed up recovery. I like this on tempo run days and faster. So tempo days, VO2 max, speed workouts, glycolytic days later on. This is one of the great days to do this. And as I mentioned, it can be done the day after a harder day to a point. These are medium days, so they can be done after a harder day, but these will definitely then require 48 hours after the tempo. I would suggest saving that for specific prep. We already talked about that a little bit. I'll do this to add an extra tougher or quality workout in a microcycle early in the season during weeks when I don't really care about the meets. Again, we've already talked about that in specific prep. These pair terribly, terribly, terribly with a couple of things. First off, lifting or anything where you're really trying to improve their general strength, okay? Sure, you can do some core stuff. I like to think of it more of like chunk stuff, like hip sort of mechanical work, glute bridges, four-way hips, clamshells, all those great hip strengthening exercises and that kind of thing. But if you're talking about things where you're really trying to get them stronger by pushing their strength, you will not get what you want after a tempo workout. These lift workouts, there's just no point. You won't get it. It's not to say there's any damage being done by doing it. You're just not getting what you need. The muscles are fatigued. They're mentally fatigued. You will not get them to push their strength limitations after something like this, okay? So it's basically a waste of time. And if you're doing this long term, you're like, every day we're going to do a tempo workout, we're going to do this. They're going to be missing some quality strength days that they may need for their potential development. So lifting isn't the end of the world. Tempo runs aren't the end of the world. Let's figure out how to smartly sequence these things. These things just do not really go together. And last thing, other tempo workouts in the same microcycle. Don't do it. We talked about the specificity of the 5K. Don't get greedy with tempo runs, and that's probably where people have the biggest issue. These burn glycogen or store glucose like no other workouts you do. Even VO2 max aerobic power intervals, even if you do 4 times mile, then that's the same as mostly tempo runs, and you're probably going further on tempo runs. Glucose is your fast fuel. Your body is going to chew this up on a tempo workout. You don't want to be doing a bunch of these because your stored glucose is eventually, your glycogen is eventually going to be almost gone, okay? This is a big problem why you see kids that peak out in, like, say, October, and then by November they're dead. They're doing too many of these workouts. They have destroyed their ability to store glycogen. These are faster than aerobic threshold, so most of the fuel is used as glycogen, but they're high volume. So again, just chewing up the glycogen. Do not get greedy. If you are preparing for the 5K, tempo runs are important, okay? And funny, my kids that I train will say, Coach, you hate tempo runs, right? You have all these reasons for not doing it. It's like, I don't hate tempo runs. If I had hated tempo runs, I wouldn't have a fictitious macrocycle that we just said that had 9 in 11 weeks. I would do 0 in all the weeks if I hated them. I don't hate tempo runs. I hate when anything's sort of done incorrectly or inappropriately if you think it's being done for one reason or another. Same reason if you were learning something in a classroom and it's just not getting anything. If it's not on a test and you're learning it, same kind of thing. You need to know why you're doing it, and tempo runs are important, okay? But they are not, something that is the end-all and be-all. So, again, I get sort of accused with that with my kids sometimes. I don't hate tempo runs. They're very important, but just like anything else, if they're important, they need to be done correctly, and the frequency is a big part of that. These workouts are not the magic bullet or some kind of secret weapon workout by any means. This is not what the teams that are winning all the state championships in your states are doing a bunch of times, and that's why they're doing. There is no secret weapon, magic bullet type of workout. These need to be done appropriately, the right amount, at the right intensity, for the right extent, at the right times of your training year, just like everything else. So that's, there's a lot of caveats that I threw into this workout. It's just that a lot of people have defaulted to doing too much of these, too fast, or too long, and then they end up being too slow, or too much rest, and all these different things. Just like everything else, there's a right way to do it. So these should be done, but in keeping in line with the specific adaptations needed for success in the given event. We've just been dealing with the 5K and cross countries. We talked about if it was a 10K or some other workout, or some other race, this conversation would be very different. If this was for the 800, very different workouts and different reasons of doing it. 10K, marathon, half marathon. This is just for the 5K and what this kind of pairs up. The 5K is very specific. We looked at sort of it being so specific to VO2 max, and we got to figure out how can these things accentuate that. So hopefully you guys have a better idea of why you would want to do a tempo workout and how they fit in. Hopefully you don't think that I hate tempo workouts either, because I don't. I really like tempo workouts. I think they can really benefit you or who you're training in their training year as they're doing this. So hopefully that all came across in the video. If you have any questions, please ask them in the comments down below. I'd love to answer them. If you like this video, please give it a like. If you have been liking these videos, I do about 3 to 5 of these each week on mostly running, but also during the track season. We do some track-related field events and all those different things too. Please give it a subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. It helps it appear in other people's feeds that have interests that are the same. So if you have been liking these videos or think that you'd like to watch more of them in the future, please hit that subscribe button. It only helps the channel grow and have it help maybe other people if it has enough subscribers. And if you think it's important for somebody else, maybe share it around. Maybe it's something that you sort of like aha'd in this type of thing about why you're doing it, and that's an important thing too. So think about sharing it around if it's something that you found helpful also. Those are all the workouts we do in general prep. I'm still going to be looking at general prep for a little bit. I'll look at off days. We'll look at a video on some volumes. I had somebody suggest doing a video on proper warm-ups and cool-downs and that kind of thing. That I'll be doing in the next little bit. And then when I've done a couple of those, we'll start looking at some specific prep workouts later in the training year. So until next time, this has been Coachy TV.